There's a certain strength in having a focused, singular purpose. A lot of the games that come out nowadays they have these grand open worlds with so many things to do. They take you hither and yon. But sometimes a more intimate, personal experience can be much more rewarding. We saw a great example of this last year with God of War, but I actually want to go back a little farther and take a look at Hellblade. Hellblade was developed by Ninja Theory and published by, well, also Ninja Theory. Like many developers, Ninja Theory has a lot of experience working with, and sometimes seemingly against, game publishers. AAA gaming is a concept largely defined by publishers. Nominally it means nice graphics, solid gameplay, and a somewhat engaging story. Unfortunately, a lot of the time publishers will put an emphasis on profits above all else, and so unique ideas, creative art styles, and even entire genres of games can be just written off because they're not trending at the time. Risk is avoided as much as possible.
Well, for starters, linear games don't sell as well. People like games like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Red Dead Redemption, Spider-Man. Why not add more side quests and objectives to the game? What are your plans for monetization? We found that loot boxes are very effective. Our focus groups have shown a strong positive reaction to multiplayer. Hallucinations don't play well in focus groups. Could you create some additional content for DLC later? A season pass could really bolster our finances. The main character should be more attractive. How many skins will the main character have? Maybe the weapons can have multiple skins?
I think a partnership with Taco Bell is completely reasonable.
What are your plans for the main character should be more attractive.
This is something Ninja Theory didn't like. They didn't want to curtail their games to all the demands the publishers would make for fear of losing the game's heart, and worse, their passion for making it. There exists something of a rift between AAA games and indie games. Overblown budgets and crazy detailed graphics versus tiny 5-person teams and constraints of time and money. There was a time when the mid-tier game could exist, but publishers nowadays are much less inclined to fund something that won't make their profit charts explode. And so Ninja Theory published their own game, an 8-hour, story-focused experience that explored things like Norse mythology, loss, psychosis, and even abuse. It's a game with AAA quality that has a narrower focus, a lower budget, and a smaller price point. Indie AAA, as they put it. Not exactly the most creative title, but it's the idea that counts. The game released digitally on PlayStation 4 and PC in August of 2017, and for Xbox in April of 2018. The game then got its physical release in December. I was glad to hear that I could own a physical copy of the game. I wanted something to sit on my shelf physically as opposed to something that I have on my system that I might delete later for space. Looking at you, Red Dead Redemption 2. I wanted to support the game just based on the principle of what they were doing. And what they ended up making is a game with 3 main pillars: narrative, combat, and puzzles. Hellblade is one of them linear games. There are very few opportunities for exploration, and those that do exist just give you a little extra dose of world building or character interaction, so if that doesn't interest you, there's really no reason to stray off the path laid out for you. Obviously, this is a consequence of the fact that it doesn't have a big publisher behind it with a lot of money, and you can see evidence of this in many facets of the game. The linear progression, the live-action performances, the judicious use of actual character models, the initial lack of variety in enemies and puzzles. But that's not to say any of these limitations are bad or detract from the experience. They're creative choices made around the limitations that Ninja Theory faced. I would say my only major issue with the game is the way it starts. The opening cutscene itself is long. I mean, it's probably only a few minutes long, but there's not a whole lot going on visually, and I was just really wanting to take control of the character and do something, even if it's just walking around. Then once the game actually gets started, it takes a little while to really pull you in. It's fine for the first few hours, but once you pass a certain point, there's a noticeable improvement in all 3 of the pillars I mentioned earlier. My other smaller gripe is with the combat and the decision to not explain anything about it. This game has a very minimalist design in terms of heads-up display. There really isn't one, and buttons and game mechanics are never directly referenced. For the most part, I like this decision, but when it comes to the combat, I feel like I missed out on some of the most interesting parts for most or all of the game. In terms of learning what the controls are, this is what you get. So the combat consists of light attack, heavy attack, dodge, block. Now, some people more creative and experimentative than myself may suss out some of the finer points of combat on their own, but I was just dodging and then mashing either square or triangle for most of the game. And triangle seemed to be objectively better, so I would usually just be pressing that. Turns out there's a lot of cool shit you can do, like parrying. Holy fuck, I didn't realize parrying was an option until I finished the game and saw someone mention it online. I actually restarted the game just so I could experience some of the combat stuff I missed out on the first time. One could argue that this is one way the developers can encourage players to play more than once. While this is true, I think my first playthrough would have been that little bit more enjoyable if I knew that parries and combos existed. Having said all that, the combat is surprisingly fun and deeper than I expected. There are a couple of new mechanics that get introduced over the course of the game, and they really change the way you strategize and overcome your opponents. It's a very intimate type of combat. Your camera is locked to the nearest enemy, and you can move it to another enemy, but you will always be focused on someone. This means you have to strategically position yourself so that you don't get surrounded, because that can get ugly quick. But if you're about to be attacked, from the side or behind, the voices in Senua's head will warn you, so you can retreat.
The voices obviously play a major role in this game, as do the other aspects of Senua's psychosis. As the developers make clear, they actually spoke with healthcare professionals as well as people who suffer from psychosis to represent it in-game as best they could.
This theme of psychosis is something that likely wouldn't be explored if the game were funded by a big publisher. People are very particular about what others do with their money, and having a character that has these hallucinations and fixations would not be seen as having broad appeal. So at best we would probably see a very watered down version of it. Senua has voices in her head that speak to her almost constantly, oftentimes simultaneously, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering. She also has visual hallucinations, calling into question what's real and what's in her head.
Another aspect of Senua's psychosis that may not be as familiar to some is an obsession with patterns. A lot of the puzzles in the game have to do with Nordic runes and finding their shapes in the environment around you, making connections where most people wouldn't.
The puzzles in this game range from harmless to potentially frustrating. Again, the developers took a very minimalist approach in explaining the puzzles, and I personally ran into one in the latter half that made me think I had glitched the game because I didn't think it was possible for me to find a solution. It turned out to just be obtuse, and it may not happen to everyone, but it did happen to me. Otherwise, the puzzles are alright. They're fine for the sake of pacing and having another thing to do, but as I said, they mostly come down to finding these Nordic rune shapes. They're nothing to write home about, but nothing to really complain about either. The story is what really shines in this game. It's what kept me going in the first few hours, although even the story at first wasn't blowing me away. But it was decent enough, and I wanted to see more, and it only got better as it went. The basic idea is that Senua's love has died, and she's journeying into hell itself to save his soul. As you can imagine, the game is pretty dark, in tone and in theme.
It's definitely a tragic tale, and something that comes up often is the darkness, which is mostly Senua's name for her psychosis, but it also manifests physically as rot that grows on her arm each time the player dies until it gets to her head, at which point there's permadeath. It actually erases your save file. But I wouldn't worry about this too much. Having died a few times myself, I found that the bark doesn't have very much bite.
Throughout the game, I felt many emotions, mostly on the lower end of the spectrum. Oftentimes, the best feeling I would get from the game was relief, after escaping a perilous or terrifying situation. Beyond that, there's a lot of misery, fear, confusion, and tiny, tiny glimmers of hope. But it's all incredibly compelling. This game can be truly beautiful, even when it's depicting something terrifying or generally unpleasant. Like most other aspects, the visuals started kind of weak and improved significantly over the course of the game. The sound also plays a crucial role. Ninja Theory knew they'd have to emphasize this if they were going to represent psychosis at all accurately. For the voices, they used a microphone specifically built to pick up sounds exactly as the human ear would. To say this game is best played with headphones is an understatement. The audio can be haunting at times, in the best way. And the music in the game can be sparse, but there are a few moments when it really elevates the experience to a whole new level.
Overall, this game really delivered on what it set out to do. Ninja Theory got to make their game without having to rely on a big publisher. which is not to say that's what they're going to do moving forward. They actually just got bought out by Microsoft to make games exclusively for the Xbox, under the condition that they get to retain complete creative freedom. If this condition is met, then they may get the best of both worlds. Here's hoping.
Basically, you should play this game. It's a little slow at first, but the experience as a whole is unforgettable. It's a home run in my book, and I can't wait to see what Ninja Theory will create in the future.